The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Compound in California. 23-year-old adjusted his dive mask one final time before entering the pool facility. This was week 14 of basic underwater demolition training, and every muscle in his body ached from months of relentless conditioning. The concrete walls echoed with the sound of boots on wet floors as his class filed in for what they assumed would be another standard pool exercise. Chief Petty Officer Hawkins stood at the pool's edge, his muscular frame casting an imposing silhouette against the fluorescent lights. At 38, Hawkins had been an instructor for 6 years, with a reputation that preceded him through every SEAL training cycle. His methods were known to push recruits beyond their breaking points, but something seemed different today. His usual stern expression carried an edge that made several trainees exchange worried glances. Had heard the whispers about Hawkins from previous classes. Stories of excessive physical confrontations, of recruits being held underwater longer than safety protocols allowed, of training exercises that crossed the line from challenging to dangerous. But these were just rumors, weren't they? The Navy had oversight systems, safety officers, protocols that prevented instructors from going too far. The pool area fell silent as Hawkins began his briefing. His voice carried across the water with military precision, outlining what he called an enhanced drown-proofing exercise. The standard drill involved having hands and feet bound while treading water, but Hawkins had modifications in mind. He spoke of extended underwater durations, of resistance training while submerged, of pushing past the body's natural survival instincts. Felt his stomach tighten as he listened. Something in Hawkins' tone suggested this wasn't about training anymore. This felt personal, vindictive even. The instructor's eyes seemed to linger on certain trainees longer than others, and realized with growing dread that he was one of them. The previous week had been particularly challenging for. During a land navigation exercise, he had questioned one of Hawkins' route selections, suggesting an alternative path that would be safer for the team. It was a minor disagreement, handled professionally, but noticed how Hawkins' jaw had tightened, how his eyes had narrowed with what looked like barely contained anger. Now, standing poolside in nothing but swim trunks, wondered if that moment of speaking up had marked him for special attention. The other instructors present seemed unusually quiet, their typical banter replaced by tense silence. Even Petty Officer Collins, usually the most approachable of the training staff, avoided eye contact with the recruits. Hawkins called the first group into the water. 5 trainees, including, lowered themselves into the chlorinated depths. The water was colder than usual, and noticed that the pool's safety equipment had been moved farther from the edge than normal. The rescue hooks that typically remained within arm's reach of instructors now sat several feet away. As the binding began, felt the familiar restriction of having his hands tied behind his back and his ankles secured together. This part was standard, something he had done dozens of times before. But when Hawkins approached him specifically, saw something in the instructor's eyes that made his blood run cold. There was no professionalism there, no concern for training objectives or safety protocols. There was only anger and something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. The exercise began simply enough. The bound trainees bobbed in the water, using core strength and precise movements to stay afloat. Found his rhythm quickly, his months of training paying off as he maintained his position in the pool. But after only a few minutes, Hawkins called for the first modification. Hawkins barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You seem to be having too easy a time. Let's see how you handle some real pressure." Before could respond, Hawkins was in the water beside him. The instructor's powerful hands gripped shoulders, and suddenly he was being forced downward. This wasn't part of any training protocol new. The standard exercise involved voluntary submersion for specific time intervals, with instructors monitoring from poolside. But Hawkins was in the water with him now, using his superior size and strength to keep submerged far longer than any safety guideline would allow. His lungs began to burn as he struggled against the instructor's grip. He tried to signal that he needed air, but Hawkins only pressed him deeper. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. His vision began to blur at the edges as his body's oxygen stores depleted. This was beyond training, beyond any legitimate exercise he had ever experienced. This was assault, plain and simple, but happening in front of other instructors who seemed frozen in place by the sudden escalation. When Hawkins finally released him, shot to the surface gasping and choking. Chlorinated water burned his throat as he struggled to fill his lungs with air. But his relief was short-lived. Hawkins was already reaching for him again, that same cold expression on his face. "Not good enough, recruit," Hawkins said, his voice carrying a menacing quality that made several poolside trainees step backward. "Let's try that again, and this time let's see if you can learn to keep your mouth shut when your betters are talking." Realized with crystal clarity that this had nothing to do with training and everything to do with revenge for questioning Hawkins' authority the previous week. The instructor was using his position of power to settle a personal score, and the safety protocols that were supposed to protect recruits were being completely ignored. As Hawkins reached for him again, caught sight of movement at the pool facility's entrance. 3 figures in khaki uniforms were entering the building, their rank insignia catching the light. But they were too far away to see what was happening in the water, and was about to be forced under again by an instructor who seemed to have completely abandoned any pretense of legitimate training. The chlorinated water closed over his head once more as Hawkins dragged him down, and wondered if anyone would intervene before this exercise turned deadly. The 3 officers who had entered the pool facility were not ordinary visitors. Captain James Mitchell, Captain Sarah, Captain Robert Torres, and Captain David represented the highest levels of Naval Special Warfare Command. They had arrived unannounced for what was supposed to be a routine inspection of training protocols, but what they witnessed in the pool would change everything. Captain Mitchell, with 22 years of SEAL experience, had seen his share of intense training scenarios. But as he watched Chief Hawkins' force recruit underwater for the 3rd time in less than 10 minutes, every alarm bell in his military mind began ringing. This wasn't training. This was abuse of power, plain and simple. Captain, the only female officer among the group, had spent years fighting to establish herself in the male-dominated world of special operations. She had zero tolerance for instructors who used their authority to victimize those under their command. Her jaw tightened as she observed Hawkins holding submerged well beyond any reasonable safety limit. Struggled violently against Hawkins' grip as his oxygen-starved brain began to shut down non-essential functions. The instructor's hands felt like steel clamps on his shoulders, forcing him deeper into the pool even as his body's survival instincts screamed for air. Above him, distorted by the chlorinated water, he could see the blurry shapes of other trainees watching helplessly from poolside. Hawkins seemed completely absorbed in his abuse of power, unaware that 4 of the most senior officers in naval special warfare had just witnessed his actions. His face showed a sick satisfaction as he felt struggles weakening beneath his grip. In his twisted mind, this was justice for being questioned by a mere recruit. But Captain Torres had seen enough. The former SEAL Team 6 operator moved with the fluid precision that had made him legendary in special operations circles. Without a word to his colleagues, he strode to the pool's edge and dove in fully clothed, his khaki uniform darkening as he entered the water. The sound of Torres hitting the water was like a thunderclap in the enclosed facility. Every head turned toward the sudden splash, including Hawkins, who finally looked up to see 4 senior officers staring at him with expressions that promised severe consequences. Torres reached Hawkins, and in 3 powerful strokes, his hand clamped down on Hawkins' wrist with enough force to make the instructor cry out in surprise and pain. "Release him immediately," Torres commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in special operations. Hawkins' grip unloosened instantly and shot to the surface like a cork, gasping and coughing up chlorinated water. His vision was blurred, his lungs burned, and his entire body shook from oxygen deprivation and adrenaline. But he was alive, pulled back from the edge of what could have been a training fatality. Captain, meanwhile, had been observing the other instructors present during the incident. Their body language told a story of complicity through inaction. These were trained military personnel who had watched a colleague cross every line of acceptable conduct without intervening. In his mind, their silence made them accessories to assault. "Chief Hawkins," Captain Mitchell's voice cut through the pool area like a blade. His tone carried the weight of absolute command authority. "Exit the pool immediately and report to the facility commander's office." Hawkins treaded water for a moment, his mind clearly racing as he tried to process how quickly his world had just collapsed. The 4 senior officers staring at him represented more combined military authority than most personnel would encounter in their entire careers. There was no talking his way out of this, no spinning the incident as legitimate training. As Hawkins hauled himself out of the pool, water streaming from his soaked uniform, Captain was already on her radio. Her clipped, professional tone requested immediate medical evaluation for and ordered the facility commander to report to the pool area immediately. She also requested that military police be dispatched to secure the scene. Remained in the water, supported by Captain Torres, as his breathing gradually returned to normal. The senior officer's presence was both protective and reassuring, a stark contrast to the threatening authority Hawkins had wielded moments before. Torres spoke quietly too, asking about his condition and whether he needed immediate medical attention. The other trainees stood frozen at poolside, uncertain whether they should continue with their exercise or wait for instructions. The remaining instructors looked equally confused, realizing that they were likely about to face serious questions about their failure to intervene during what was clearly an assault on a trainee. Captain Mitchell addressed the group with military precision. His voice carried across the facility, ensuring everyone present understood the gravity of what they had witnessed. This training evolution is terminated immediately. All personnel will remain in this facility until military police arrive to take statements. The facility commander, a harried-looking lieutenant colonel, arrived within minutes of Captain's radio call. His face went ashen as he took in the scene. One of his instructors dripping wet and clearly in serious trouble, 4 senior SEAL officers overseeing what was obviously a major incident, and a recruit who appeared to have nearly drowned during what should have been routine training. Hawkins stood near the pool's edge, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The sick satisfaction he had felt while abusing was replaced by the cold realization that his military career was effectively over. Assault on a subordinate, abuse of authority, violation of safety protocols, and endangering a service member's life were charges that would likely result in court-martial and imprisonment. Captain Torres helped out of the pool and onto a bench where he could recover more comfortably. The senior officer's actions spoke volumes about the difference between legitimate authority and abuse of power. Where Hawkins had used his position to victimize someone under his command, Torres used his rank to protect and defend. The medical corpsman arrived and began evaluating for signs of near drowning, oxygen deprivation, and physical trauma. His preliminary assessment suggested that had come dangerously close to losing consciousness underwater, which could have easily resulted in death if the incident had continued much longer. As military police began securing the scene and separating witnesses for individual interviews, Captain pulled the facility commander aside for a private conversation. The lieutenant colonel's career was also in jeopardy, as his command oversight had allowed an instructor to operate without proper supervision or accountability. The 3 other instructors who had been present during the incident stood together near the equipment storage area, their faces showing the dawning realization that they too would face serious consequences for their failure to intervene. In the military justice system, witnessing assault and failing to stop it could result in charges ranging from dereliction of duty to accessory after the fact. Hawkins made one final attempt to salvage his situation, approaching Captain Mitchell with what he clearly hoped would be a convincing explanation of his actions. But the senior officer's expression made it clear that no explanation would be acceptable for what they had witnessed. The pool facility, which had been filled with the sounds of training just minutes before, now buzzed with the controlled chaos of a criminal investigation. Evidence was being documented, statements were being taken, and careers were being ended with the mechanical precision of military justice. For still recovering on the bench with a medical corpsman monitoring his condition, the full impact of what had happened was just beginning to sink in. He had come within minutes, perhaps seconds, of becoming a training fatality. Only the unexpected arrival of 4 senior officers had saved his life. The investigation that followed moved with the swift efficiency of military justice when senior leadership demands answers. Within hours of the pool incident, a formal inquiry board was established with Captain Mitchell as the presiding officer. The gravity of the situation was evident in the speed with which resources were mobilized and evidence secured. Found himself in the base medical facility, undergoing comprehensive evaluation for both physical and psychological trauma. The attending physician, Commander Lisa Park, had seen her share of training injuries over the years, but near-drowning incidents involving instructor misconduct were thankfully rare. Her examination revealed minor throat irritation from chlorinated water and elevated stress hormones consistent with a life-threatening experience, but no permanent physical damage. The psychological evaluation would prove more complex. Military psychologist Major Roberts spent several hours with, documenting not just the immediate trauma of the pool incident, but also exploring the broader pattern of intimidation and harassment that had led up to it. Found himself describing weeks of escalating tension with Chief Hawkins, incidents that had seemed minor at the time, but now formed a clear pattern of targeting. Meanwhile, the military police investigation was uncovering disturbing details about Hawkins' conduct as an instructor. Interviews with current and former trainees revealed a pattern of excessive force, verbal abuse, and safety violations that had been occurring for months. Several recruits described incidents where Hawkins had used training exercises as opportunities to settle personal grudges or assert dominance through intimidation. Petty Officer Second Class David Murphy, who had completed Bud S training 6 months earlier, provided particularly damaging testimony. He described an incident where Hawkins had forced him to perform push-ups in a pool of ice water for over an hour after questioning a training directive. Murphy had developed hypothermia and required medical treatment, but the incident had been covered up as a training accident. The 3 other instructors present during the incident found themselves facing increasingly serious charges as the investigation progressed. Petty Officer Collins, who had been considered the most approachable of the training staff, admitted under questioning that he had witnessed several instances of Hawkins crossing the line, but had failed to report them due to institutional pressure and fear of retaliation. Captain took personal charge of interviewing the instructors, her reputation for thoroughness and fairness making her the natural choice for such sensitive interrogations. Her questions were precise and unforgiving, designed to uncover not just what they had seen, but why they had failed in their duty to protect the trainees under their supervision. Instructor Collins, Captain's voice carried across the small interview room, you witnessed Chief Hawkins hold recruit underwater for what you estimated to be over 90 seconds. At what point did you consider intervening? Collins shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual confidence completely absent. Ma'am, I thought about it, but Chief Hawkins was the senior instructor present. I assumed he knew what he was doing, that it was part of some advanced training protocol I wasn't familiar with. Are you familiar with any training protocol that involves holding a bound trainee underwater for 90 seconds without their consent or ability to signal distress? His question hung in the air like an accusation. No, ma'am, no protocol I know of allows for that. Then why didn't you intervene when it became clear that recruit was in genuine distress? The silence that followed spoke volumes about the culture of intimidation that had developed under Hawkins' leadership. Even other instructors had been afraid to challenge his authority, creating an environment where abuse could flourish unchecked. The investigation also revealed that this wasn't Hawkins' first assignment where problems had occurred. His personnel file showed a pattern of transfers following complaints about his training methods, but previous commanders had chosen to move the problem rather than address it directly. This administrative shuffling had allowed Hawkins to continue his pattern of abuse across multiple training facilities. Captain Torres, meanwhile, had taken on the task of reviewing safety protocols and oversight procedures. His analysis revealed systematic failures in the command structure that had allowed instructors to operate with minimal supervision. Training exercises were being conducted without proper safety briefings. Medical personnel were often absent during high-risk activities, and there was no effective system for trainees to report instructor misconduct without fear of retaliation. The facility commander, Lieutenant Colonel, found himself fighting for his own career as the investigation revealed the depth of oversight failures under his command. His meetings with the inquiry board grew increasingly tense as evidence mounted that he had been warned about Hawkins' methods but had failed to take appropriate action. Colonel, Captain Mitchell's tone was professionally cold during one particularly difficult session. You received a written complaint about Chief Hawkins 6 weeks ago from Recruit Johnson, who alleged that the instructor had struck him during a training evolution. What action did you take? His response revealed the casual dismissal of trainee concerns that had enabled the toxic environment. Sir, I discussed the matter with Chief Hawkins. He assured me that any physical contact was within the bounds of acceptable training methods. Recruit Johnson was struggling in several areas, and I felt his complaint might be an attempt to avoid responsibility for his own performance issues. Did you interview any witnesses to the alleged incident? No, sir. I felt Chief Hawkins' word was sufficient. Did you review video footage from the training area where the incident allegedly occurred? No, sir. I didn't feel it was necessary. The pattern was clear. Complaints had been dismissed, investigations had been avoided, and trainees had been left without effective recourse against instructor abuse. The institutional failures were as damaging as the individual misconduct. As the investigation progressed, found himself becoming something of a reluctant hero among his fellow trainees. His willingness to speak truthfully about his experiences, despite the potential impact on his military career, encouraged others to come forward with their own stories of abuse and intimidation. The broader SEAL community began to take notice as word of the investigation spread. Senior enlisted personnel and officers who had gone through their own training decades earlier expressed shock at how far standards had fallen. The ethos of the SEAL community emphasized pushing individuals to their absolute limits, but always within a framework of safety and mutual respect that seemed to have been abandoned under Hawkins' instruction. Captains spent considerable time reviewing the legal implications of the case. The charges against Hawkins were mounting: assault, abuse of authority, violation of safety regulations, and conduct unbecoming. Each charge carried serious penalties, and the combination could result in decades of imprisonment along with dismissal from service. The three other instructors faced their own legal jeopardy. Failure to intervene during an assault, dereliction of duty, and conspiracy to conceal misconduct were all being considered by the legal review team. Their military careers were effectively over, regardless of whether they faced court-martial or were allowed to resign under other than honorable conditions. But perhaps most significant was the institutional reckoning that was beginning to take shape. The investigation had revealed systemic problems that went far beyond one rogue instructor. The entire training philosophy would need to be examined, safety protocols would need to be overhauled, and the culture of fear and intimidation would need to be replaced with one of accountability and respect. For still recovering from his near-death experience, the investigation provided some sense that justice would be served. But he also understood that his experience had exposed problems that would take years to fully address, and that other trainees in other facilities might still be facing the same risks he had encountered in that pool. The court-martial proceedings began 3 weeks after the pool incident, held in the austere courtroom of Naval Base. The military justice system moved with deliberate precision, and the evidence compiled during the investigation painted a damning picture of systematic abuse and institutional failure. Chief Petty Officer Hawkins sat at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of a man watching his life disintegrate. His military attorney, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against her client was overwhelming, captured not just in witness testimony but in medical records, training logs, and the damaging statements of his fellow instructors. The prosecution, led by Commander Michael, opened with a methodical presentation of the charges. Assault in the first degree, abuse of authority under Article 92, conduct unbecoming an officer under Article 133, and violation of safety regulations. Each charge was supported by meticulous documentation and witness testimony that painted a clear picture of escalating misconduct. Took the witness stand on the second day of proceedings. His testimony was calm and factual, describing not just the pool incident, but the weeks of escalating tension that had preceded it. Under direct examination, he recounted the fear he had felt as Hawkins held him underwater, the burning sensation in his lungs as his oxygen supply depleted, and the certainty that he was going to die in that pool. "Recruit," Commander's voice carried clearly through the courtroom. "At any point during your submersion, did you feel that your life was in danger?" "Yes, sir. After the first minute underwater, I knew something was wrong. After 2 minutes, I was certain I was going to drown. Chief Hawkins wasn't responding to my struggles to surface. He seemed to be holding me down deliberately, with more force than any training exercise would require." Under cross-examination, Lieutenant Commander Hayes attempted to portray the incident as a training evolution that had simply gone wrong. But calm, detailed responses undermined every attempt to minimize the severity of what had occurred. The medical testimony provided by Commander Park was particularly damaging to Hawkins' case. Her analysis showed that it had come within minutes of losing consciousness underwater, which could have easily resulted in brain damage or death. The pattern of injuries and stress responses were consistent with assault rather than legitimate training activities. But perhaps most damaging was the testimony of the 4 senior officers who had witnessed the incident firsthand. Captain Mitchell's account of what he had observed was devastating in its clinical precision. His 30 years of military experience lent weight to his assessment that what he witnessed was assault, not training. Captain Mitchell, the prosecutor continued, in your extensive experience with SEAL training protocols, have you ever witnessed an instructor hold a bound trainee underwater for the duration you observed in this incident? Never. The safety protocols for drown-proofing exercises are very specific. Instructors remain poolside for immediate intervention if needed. They do not enter the water to physically restrain trainees underwater. What I witnessed was completely outside the bounds of any legitimate training protocol. Captain Torr's testimony about his decision to intervene physically was equally compelling. His immediate recognition that was in mortal danger, and his split-second decision to enter the pool fully clothed, demonstrated the severity of the situation from the perspective of one of the Navy's most experienced special operations officers. The testimony of the other instructors who had been present proved particularly damaging, not just to Hawkins, but to the broader culture of intimidation that had enabled his misconduct. Petty Officer Collins' admission that he had witnessed multiple instances of inappropriate behavior, but had failed to report them, revealed the systemic nature of the problem. Lieutenant Colonel's testimony as facility commander was a study in bureaucratic failure. His attempts to justify his lack of oversight and investigation into previous complaints only highlighted the institutional negligence that had allowed the situation to escalate. By the time he stepped down from the witness stand, it was clear that his own career was effectively over. The defense's case was built around the argument that Hawkins had been acting within his authority as a training instructor, pushing recruits to their limits, as was expected in elite military training. But this argument collapsed under the weight of expert testimony about training safety and the clear evidence of personal animosity toward former trainees about a pattern of behavior that went far beyond legitimate training stress. Recruit Johnson described the incident where Hawkins had struck him, corroborating his earlier written complaint that had been dismissed by another former trainee, Petty Officer Martinez, about being forced to perform dangerous underwater exercises as punishment for minor infractions. The pattern that emerged was clear. Hawkins had used his position of authority to settle personal grudges, intimidate trainees who questioned his methods, and create an atmosphere of fear that prevented victims from seeking help. This wasn't training, it was systematic abuse of power. Dr. Williams, a military psychiatrist specializing in training trauma, provided expert testimony about the psychological impact of instructor abuse on military trainees. Her analysis of condition, along with interviews with other victims, revealed classic symptoms of abuse trauma that extended far beyond the physical aspects of the incidents. The psychological impact of instructor abuse in military training environments is particularly severe, Dr. Williams, because it violates the trust relationship that is essential to effective military education. When instructors become predators rather than mentors, the psychological damage can be more severe and longer-lasting than physical injuries. The prosecution's closing arguments methodically connected each piece of evidence to the charges against Hawkins. The case was presented not as an isolated incident of training gone wrong, but as the culmination of a pattern of abuse that had been enabled by institutional failures and the silence of those who should have intervened. Commander's final words to the court-martial panel were uncompromising. Chief Hawkins violated every principle of military leadership when he used his position to assault recruit. He betrayed the trust placed in him by the Navy. He endangered the life of a service member under his care, and he corrupted the training environment that is supposed to produce our nation's elite warriors. The defense's closing argument was a desperate attempt to minimize the severity of the incident, portraying Hawkins as a dedicated instructor whose methods had simply been misunderstood. But Lieutenant Commander Hayes faced an impossible task given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct and the credible testimony of senior officers who had witnessed the assault firsthand. The court-martial panel, composed of 5 senior officers with extensive military training experience, retired to deliberate after 3 days of testimony. The evidence was so overwhelming that their discussions focused not on whether Hawkins was guilty, but on the appropriate severity of his sentence. Outside the courtroom, waited with a mixture of anticipation and exhaustion. The legal proceedings had forced him to relive the most traumatic experience of his military career, but he understood that his willingness to testify had been crucial to ensuring that justice was served and that other trainees would be protected from similar abuse. The broader SEAL community watched the proceedings with intense interest. The case had become a watershed moment for military training culture, forcing a long-overdue reckoning with practices that had been tolerated or ignored for too long. Senior leadership understood that the outcome of this court-martial would send a clear message about acceptable standards of conduct for military instructors. As the panel prepared to announce their verdict, everyone present understood that they were witnessing more than just the resolution of one criminal case. This was the moment when the military justice system would either validate the principle that no one is above the law, regardless of rank or position, or demonstrate that institutional protection of bad actors remained stronger than accountability to victims. The court-martial panel returned after less than 2 hours of deliberation. Their swift decision spoke volumes about the clarity of the evidence and the severity of the crimes. As the panel president, Colonel Davis, rose to announce the verdict, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Chief Petty Officer Hawkins, this court finds you guilty of all charges and specifications. The words echoed through the courtroom like a gavel striking stone. Hawkins' face drained of color as the full weight of his conviction settled upon him. His military career, spanning 15 years, was effectively over. But more than that, he faced the prospect of significant prison time and the lifelong stigma of being a convicted felon. The sentencing phase revealed the full scope of consequences for Hawkins' actions. Reduction in rank to seaman recruit, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, confinement for 8 years, and dismissal from the naval service with a dishonorable discharge. The panel had sent an unmistakable message that abuse of authority, particularly when it endangered lives, would face the harshest possible punishment. Watched from the gallery as military police led Hawkins away in restraints. There was no satisfaction in seeing his former instructor destroyed, only a sense of closure and relief that the system had finally worked as it was supposed to. The young man who had nearly died in that pool had played a crucial role in ensuring that no other trainee would face the same danger. The 3 other instructors who had been present during the incident faced their own courts-martial in the following weeks. Their sentences were less severe than Hawkins, but equally career-ending. Petty Officer Collins received 4 years confinement and dismissal from service. The other 2 instructors were sentenced to 3 years each, with reductions in rank and dishonorable discharges. Lieutenant Colonel's fate was decided through administrative rather than judicial proceedings. Rather than face a court-martial for dereliction of duty, he was allowed to retire at reduced rank with a letter of reprimand that effectively ended any possibility of future military employment. His failure to investigate complaints and provide adequate oversight had created the conditions that allowed Hawkins to operate with impunity. But the institutional changes that followed the court-martial proceedings proved more significant than any individual punishment. Admiral, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, announced a comprehensive overhaul of training protocols that addressed every systemic failure revealed during the investigation. New safety protocols required that all high-risk training evolutions be conducted with medical personnel present. Video recording of pool exercises became mandatory, with footage subject to random review by command authorities. Most importantly, an anonymous reporting system was established that allowed trainees to report instructor misconduct without fear of retaliation. Captain Mitchell was appointed to head a task force charged with reviewing training methods across all SEAL facilities. His mandate was broad: identify and eliminate practices that cross the line from challenging to abusive, establish clear guidelines for instructor conduct, and create accountability mechanisms to prevent future incidents. The cultural transformation was equally important. Senior leadership made clear that the days of tolerating abusive instructors in the name of tough training were over. The SEAL community's reputation for excellence would be built on legitimate challenge and professional mentorship, not fear and intimidation. Completed his Bud S training 4 months after the court-martial, graduating as the honor man of his class. His courage in speaking out against abuse had earned him the respect of instructors and fellow trainees alike. But more importantly, his willingness to testify had helped create a safer training environment for everyone who would follow. The new training protocols were put to the test during final weeks of Bud S, when a substitute instructor attempted to use excessive force during a land navigation exercise. Several trainees immediately reported the incident through the new anonymous system. The instructor was removed from duty within hours, investigated within days, and transferred out of training command within a week. Captain Torres, who had risked his uniform to save in the pool, was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his heroic intervention. His citation read in part, "Captain Torres' immediate recognition of a life-threatening situation and his selfless action to intervene prevented the death of a service member and demonstrated the highest traditions of military leadership." The 4 senior officers who had witnessed the original incident became powerful advocates for training reform throughout the military. Their combined influence ensured that the lessons learned from the case were implemented not just in SEAL training, but across all high-risk military education programs. 6 months after his conviction, Hawkins sat in the military prison at Fort Leavenworth, stripped of rank and facing years of confinement. His fall from respected instructor to convicted felon served as a stark reminder that no position of authority provided immunity from accountability. The military justice system had demonstrated that when senior leadership was willing to act decisively, even entrenched cultures of abuse could be dismantled. The broader impact of the case extended throughout the military training community. Other instructors who had been pushing ethical boundaries suddenly found themselves under closer scrutiny. Training commands across all services reviewed their protocols and accountability measures, understanding that the case had established new standards for acceptable conduct. For now Petty Officer Second Class, after completing advanced training, the experience had been transformative in ways he never expected. His near-death experience in that pool had led not just to personal survival, but to systemic change that would protect countless future service members from similar abuse. He remained in contact with the 4 senior officers who had saved his life, particularly Captain Torres, who became an informal mentor as progressed in his military career. Their relationship demonstrated the positive potential of military mentorship when conducted with respect and genuine concern for subordinate development. The pool facility where the incident occurred was eventually renovated and renamed the Safety Training Center, a permanent reminder of the price of institutional complacency and the importance of protecting those who serve. A plaque near the entrance read, "Courage is not just facing the enemy in combat, but standing up to wrongdoing wherever it occurs." Years later, as advanced through the ranks and eventually became an instructor himself, he would tell his own trainees about the day 4 SEAL captains chose to intervene rather than look away. He would emphasize that true military strength came not from the ability to inflict suffering, but from the wisdom to prevent it and the courage to act when others remained silent. The legacy of that day in the pool extended far beyond the individual participants. It marked a turning point in military training culture, a moment when the institution chose accountability over expedience and protection of the vulnerable over protection of the powerful. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work when good people chose to do the right thing, regardless of personal cost or institutional pressure. Hawkins would spend the next 8 years reflecting on how his abuse of power had destroyed not just his own career, but had threatened the life of a young man whose only crime had been questioning his authority. The military had sent a clear message. Those entrusted with training the next generation of warriors would be held to the highest standards of conduct, and failure to meet those standards would result in swift and severe consequences. In the end, the case became a textbook example of how institutions can reform themselves when leadership has the will to confront difficult truths and implement meaningful change. The 4 senior officers had ended Hawkins' career in seconds, but their actions had positive effects that would last for generations of future military trainees.